Yeah. All right. Well, you know who I am. Right. So my brief tonight is to talk about the history of birds. So I decided to look at three themes. One is think about the history of the ornithology in Trinidad, and then during that period, what has been changing with the avifauna, what the birds have been doing, and also touch a little bit on what is special about the birds of Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to stress that I'm talking as a bird watcher, as somebody who really enjoys the birds, somebody who gets a lot of enjoyment going out in the forest, adding to my quality of life. This is nothing about doing studies on birds. The real studies are done by people like Mark and Floyd. You remember Floyd Hayes from however many years ago. So I'm going to be talking about things from the point of view of a bird watcher. But as a club member and as somebody who enjoys birds, we are all very, very passionate about making sure that we maintain the diversity in Trinidad. Not just the birds, but Reno will be interested in the frogs and the snakes. Some people are interested in mammals, some people are interested in plants, and we all share that. So it's really important to me that when we go and enjoy our hobby, that we are able to contribute to the knowledge of the birds, so that the people who are actually doing the studies will have that information available to them. So I'll be looking at these three themes. Now, I've sort of condensed the history part into really one slide, because it's been some time now since Richard French left the club. It's been some time now since he died. And I mean, most of those of us who've been here for some time would remember Richard very well. Some of the younger people wouldn't have had the privilege of meeting him. But he didn't appear out of nowhere. And some of the bird watchers may not realize that some of the work on birds started very early. There was a publication on the birds of Trinidad in 1866. It is in French, so not many of us could read it. And there were no pictures. And all the names were Latin names, so it was Latin names of birds and text in French. And a lot of people, it sort of fell by the wayside. But that early work was really important for understanding the avifauna, because that is what those people built on. There was a guy called Frank Chapman who came and did another book on birds of Trinidad and Tobago, and he had some more modern names. He introduced some vernacular names. Then there was Young and Mees in 1958. The first real bird book that we could have had our hands on, or what was available to me when I started looking at birds, was Her Plots, which was published in 1961. And that was a proper book. It looked like a bird book. It had a picture of a bird on the front. It had pictures inside. Unfortunately, the author was also the artist, and he was really not good. and he painted the birds from skins. And you see things in skins that you don't see in real life. But it was a start. But as Richard says, it was never really successful. Then Richard did his book, I think it's said 1973 was the first edition, and then he's had subsequent ones. When Richard left Trinidad, he was very concerned that he was the sort of author of the book. He was the person who everybody came to. He was the person who anybody shared records with. And he was very conscious that as an individual, he was sort of taking people's records and either accepting it and putting it in his book, or not accepting it. And that used to cause a whole lot of problems. Because when somebody saw something he didn't believe them, they would get annoyed. And he was very uncomfortable about that. So in 1996, he helped set up, it was his idea, and he set it up, the Trinidad and Tobago Redbird Committee, to go and look at records and accept records, look at them, and then have a little vote on to whether they should be added to the record or not, and we have criteria and stuff like that. eBird was started in 2002. I know none of us would have heard about it in 2002. It was a lot longer before we heard about it, but this was a lot longer before I heard about it, but that's when it really started. And then we have the current book, which is the book by Martin Kennefick. The first edition was Kennefick, Restall, and Hayes. I'm not 100% sure whether the current edition is all three authors still. It certainly is Kennefick and Restall. But I can't remember, because I haven't looked at it recently. But that is the book that everybody will use today, and that is one which has a current edition. So these were kind of the books and the checklists over the years. So we get a better idea of what we have. Now, during this time, there's also been quite a lot of research going on. There was some famous research by Belcher and Smoker in 1937. They were interested in collecting eggs. And that used to be a very popular habit, collecting eggs, like to collect stamps and butterflies and flowers and stuff like that. They did a lot of work. And then in the 1950s, the Trinidad Regional Virus Lab, which was the predecessor to the current CARET, they did a tremendous amount of work, made some really nice collections. And then around 1950, William Beebe, the famous American naturalist that everybody in here should know the name of, he set up the New York Zoological Tropical Research Station at Simla in the River Valley, and they did a whole lot of work. David and Barbara Snow were two UK entomologists who came and spent about 10, 12 years in Trinidad at Simla. During that time, Richard French, apart from writing the book, was doing quite a lot of research on lowland birds and wetland birds. And he was, at that time, he was thinking about writing the book. And he kind of had an agreement with the Snows that they will tell him about the mountain birds. He would concentrate on the lowlands and the swamps. Carol James and Howard Nelson, members of the Field Naturalist Club in the 80s, I want to just mention them because they did a lot of work on the Trinidad piping worm. And for those of you who are my age and used to do bird watching in the 80s, we never thought we would see a Trinidad piping worm because we thought at that point it probably was already extirpated. So that even though it was a short period of time, it was really important. I don't want to forget them. Then, of course, Floyd Hayes. Some of you maybe remember Floyd Hayes. He was in Mark's position a few years previously. He did a lot of work. And then we had a couple of popular accounts. There was a guy, Brookworth, who in 1967 wrote a book called The Naturalist in Trinidad. Really, really interesting book. He worked with the people at TRBL, so he kind of gives us a popular account of what they were doing. And it's a lot of fun to read. And then a guy, Lindblad, in 1969 wrote a book, Journey to the Red Birds, where he sort of popularized Caribbean Swamp and scarlet ibis. So, and then I have on the other, tucked away in the corner, don't tell the rest of the board that it's all tucked in the corner. But the formation of Israel Nature Center in 1967 had an enormous impact on our knowledge of the avifauna because of the number of visitors who came there, and then it contributed a bit to GDP, and we were known as an ecotourism destination. Now, I highlighted in red the Trinidad and Tobago Bird Status and Distribution Committee. I highlighted eBird, and I highlighted David and Barbara Snow. So I'm going to highlight fellows, because these are some things I want to look at in a little more detail. Now, Richard French wrote a nice article in Living World. I think it might have been around 1992. Sorry, I can't remember the exact date, on the history of ornithology. And he goes through in a little more detail the various researchers and what they were doing. But that was, so I want to highlight, you'll see why I want to highlight David and Barbara Snow, but also I will talk a little bit more about the Status and Distribution Committee and eBird. Now, I got this off the picture of the obituary, because there were a couple of ornithologists who really studied the impact of frugivory on the ecology of birds. So they decided that because the birds, most birds are omnivorous, they eat anything you give them or anything they can find. And most require protein food to feed their nestlings at least. So even though we think of hummingbirds as feeding on nectar, they really spend a lot of feeding on insects and spiders to feed to their nestlings. And they go around and get some nectar as well. But most birds will have a good bit of insect in their diet. So they were looking at birds that were largely frugivorous. And so they did some studies on the oilbirds, because some of you will know oilbirds are purely frugivorous. They're also nocturnal, and that business of eating fruit really affects the ecology and how they live their life and so on. They also did work on the mannequins. And those of you who like birds will know in Trinidad we have the golden-headed mannequin, the white-bearded mannequin, and in Tobago we have the blue-back mannequin. And they did work on the mannequins. And what they found in a number of these birds that fed on fruit, like the mannequins, they also did work on, here we have a blue-back mannequin from Tobago. And I've cheated a little bit because I didn't have a photograph of a bearded bellbird. But they did work on cotingas. It's the family that have bellbirds and Guyana and pocket rocks. It's not really a cheap treat because it was a naturalist trip where they take the photograph. But what they found is that the birds that fed on fruit were often had, when you're a bird feeding on fruit and not spending all the time looking at insects and stuff like that, you have time on your hands to not to be looking for food because you're feeding largely on fruit. And what they found is that they associated frugivory with lekking behavior, which is behavior where some of the birds come and the males do nice little dances and wait until the female comes around and tries to show off for her. And they develop this leck where they come and do their regular dancing. And they studied that. So they did a lot of the pioneering work on mannequins, on bellbirds in Trinidad. They went to Guyana and did work on top of the rocks and other cotingas. And they really developed a big school of study surrounding birds and frugivory. He also did work on some of the hummingbirds also exhibit lekking behavior. The green hermit and rupert-crested hermit, not rupert-crested hermit, little hermit, they have these lecks and they were studying them. And because they went through that for so long and they were writing all these papers and they were writing lots of other papers, it kind of put Trinidad on the map. And a lot of the birds that they worked on are birds we like to see. It's birds we like to take people to see. We like to show them the mannequins dancing. And because enjoying birds is not just a question of saying, okay, that's a mannequin and write it down and go write it down. You know, we want to know the bird and we want to get the feel of it. And you don't have to be a bird watcher to really enjoy looking at a golden-headed mannequin do its dance. In fact, with Trials of Life and Living World, when the Attenborough series, Attenborough spent a lot of time in Trinidad filming things like the mannequins. Those of you who watch Trials of Life will remember the famous piece of video where the mannequin is doing a little moonwalk up the branch. That was a golden-headed mannequin up at Las Lapas, and so on. Right. So I just wanted to highlight the snows work because it was so instrumental in getting Trinidad on the map, and also because they were doing the work at Simla in the River Valley. The lecks that you could visit at Azurite and some Pats and Simla, the same lecks that Snow would have been working on. And some of those lecks are still in place, even so many years after. Since then, there have been, I'm going to say hundreds, there's probably thousands of papers on these mannequins. And both David and Barbara lived to quite a ripe old age and did a lot more work. Right. So they were doing some of the early research. William Beebe also wasn't doing the research himself, but he had a series of scientists who did all sorts of exciting things. Now, generally in terms of keeping the list of birds of Trinidad kind of clean, because when you have a list of what we have, a sort of official list, it sounds a little bit like stamp collecting, but we want to have that list correct. We don't want to have things on there that are not supposed to be there, because when they get on the list, they're very hard to take off. Even when Richard wrote his book, he included a few birds, and he put them in square brackets. That basically meant they weren't supposed to be in the book. But if he didn't put them there, people will say, well, what about this one? And wasn't there a record? And then, if somebody saw a new bird and Richard put it in his book, but he put it in square brackets, they were very annoyed. So he was tidying up the list. And then, of course, the guides, the field guides. So the current field guide we're using is by Martin Floyd and Robin Restall. So I don't have a photograph of Robin, but he wasn't a club member, so not counting him. So I was saying earlier that that when Richard left, he was concerned about making sure that we keep getting these records correct and we don't make mistakes. So he kind of got together a group of people. It was originally myself, Jeffrey, who you all know, Bill Murphy, who some of you will know, Richard, Floyd, Ian Lambie, which many of you wouldn't have seen for a long time, but you should recognize this picture, and Victor Cannell. Victor Cannell didn't really pose for photographs very much, so I had to take what I could get. And the idea of the committee was that people, when they see something, will submit a record to the committee. Everybody will look at it independently, come up with an assessment, and then we have the rules as to if it's a new bird to Trinidad, it has to be unanimous. If it's not a new bird, we have to have there could only be one dissenting voice, and so on. Now this was 1996, so we no longer have. Oh, and Davis Finch was also a member. I couldn't get a photograph of him. Every time I put Davis Finch in Google, I only got a lot of birds. And putting bird next to it didn't help. But I think that the internet really kicked off around after 1996. And so people who did things like that after 1996 are easier to find. So we still have Bill, we still have me, we still have Jeffrey, we still have Floyd, we don't have Victor, we don't have Davis, we don't have Ian. And we have, I'll go back to that picture of Floyd because it's a nice picture. We have Faraz, we have Nigel, and you know who that one is. And in fact, Martin told me to remind Chris, and I'm doing it publicly, that he has a couple of votes for Martin on the last batch of records. So now that he is being publicly shamed, he will do that. So anyway, so that is the committee. Now, since 1996, the committee has looked at 1884 submissions. These are 1884 records that people have seen, and many people in the club have submitted their records. It's comprised 228 species. There were 342 observers, and as a result of this, we have an additional 53 species added to the checklist, and 11 species which are added to the South American checklist. And there are 2 that are waiting until we publish this year's Living World. The South American checklist is determined by a group called the South American Checklist Committee, who are a subgroup of the AOU, and they have criteria for which they accept the bird, and it has to be a proper published record with a photograph. So sometimes when we publish a photograph, it may not be the best photograph, but if we don't publish the photograph and it's not recognizable as such, the SACC won't accept it. And in our case, the secretary of the Rare Bird Committee is sort of our liaison with the SACC. And then, of course, there are many, I mean, these are sort of the highlighted things, but there are many more species that we have a much better idea of what their status is. Because when the committee formed, there were lots of things that we had like 2 or 3 records. Now we have 30, 40 records. The other thing that has come up, of course, for keeping records is eBird. Elizabeth referred to putting records on eBird. For those of you who don't know, eBird is a sort of citizen science worldwide platform for recording your observations. And you go and put in a checklist of what you've seen for the day. And then you know, there are various areas that you might go to, areas that people go back to frequently will be hotspots where there are lots of birds being seen, lots of checklists being submitted. And those little dots, I just went on eBird in preparation for this just to see where the hotspots were. And they're quite well distributed throughout Trinidad. Nobody seems to go to Guayabari, but that's okay. So that the eBird is a really, really powerful tool. And this next slide will show you how powerful it is. I think you can have a little focus there.
That's best we can do.
That's the best we could do. All right. Well, I'm glad to see, I just did this at random, and you'll see that I can't read those numbers. All right. So we have on eBird, we have 439 species recorded. We have 2,428 individuals have been contributing to eBird. Keep in mind that when we were talking about the history until 1996, we could probably talk of people on 2 hands and 2 feet. Now we have 28 people have contributed. We have people who have submitted thousands of checklists. You'll see Nigel Lalsing leads the list, and you'll see that I know Elizabeth is on there somewhere, very high up.
Yeah.
Right? I'm way down there at 1,700 and something because I'm not really good at putting my things on eBird. I think most of my birdwatching happened before eBird came out, and since I've been busy, so I only have 2 checklists. But it really shows. I mean, these people here, I think they deserve mention. Matt, Jerome Foster, and Martin. These are the people who are putting most of the data out on eBird, and this information is available to everybody throughout the world. Forever. You know, it's really very good information, and it's worth really when you're on your computer at some point just exploring it. Just type in eBird and see where it takes you, and you get to see what's happening. So that I put in another slide which I was interested in because I have not seen a scarlet tanager in Trinidad, and I'm very annoyed at not having seen one. I could go on eBird and I could see, you know, where the scarlet tanagers, where they are at what time of the year. And if I go on eBird, there are over 1 million, that's the number of records of scarlet tanager. All those little dots all over the place tells you about where they are, when they're coming down. We would see from here that most of the scarlet tanagers come down through Central America and on the west coast of Colombia and Peru. But some do come across the top of Venezuela and up the Antilles. But you really get I mean, it's really a powerful tool. And even though I'm a bit of a hypocrite, I encourage all bird watchers to put their records on eBird. So that the record keeping really has moved quite a long way from the author of the book having a list and so on. Now, eBird records are not, you can't just put anything on there. We do have country reviewers. So for Trinidad, the reviewers are myself and Martin. I have to acknowledge that Martin does 99% of the work. He gets a little fed up with hummingbirds and domestic birds, and he asks me to do those, but he doesn't. But he's retired, so he can afford to do that. But they are reviewed, but it's not the same level of rigor as the committee. However, we do often get photo OD submissions on eBird. It would really be good if people put in a bit of description, because sometimes it's surprising how difficult it could be to identify a bird from a photograph sometimes. Because sometimes it's the behavior, sometimes it's the part of the bird you're not seeing. And I know people will know that they see a summer tanager and they say, yes, it's a summer tanager, but it's important that they say why. Because when it's on eBird and it's just photo submitted, it's not always 100% certain. And then, of course, people get upset. So now I'm going to switch to a different theme, which is to roughly go through what some of the birds have been doing. Because the bird life of our country, and certainly of Trinidad, is not static. When Richard first wrote the first edition of his book, he talked about tropical mockingbirds and kiskidees being kind of restricted to urban areas, Port of Spain and San Augustine and San Fernando. Somehow, that must have been a relatively recent arrival, but before we started looking at the birds in detail. I grew up with kiskidees all over the place and mockingbirds all over the place. But when Richard was starting, that wasn't the case. Palm tanagers, when I started watching birds, there weren't any palm tanagers in Tobago. And David Rooks, a club member, saw a palm tanager in Tobago. Richard didn't believe him. David got annoyed. And that little feud went on for years. But David was right. And now anyway you go into Tobago, it's same plant and but there's a shift. There's also a southern lapwings, was another bird. I think it was I can't remember who first recorded, but it had Victor Connell was involved. And again, Richard was a little slow in putting it in the book, and again Victor was a little annoyed. But southern lapwings are all over the place now. And it seems as though a lot of the birds that we're getting are birds that are associated with ranching and open grassland in South America. So we have the crested caracara and the yellow-headed caracara. When I first started watching birds, somebody shouted yellow-headed caracara, and I couldn't see anything that looked like it had a baby yellow head. And I spent the rest of the day wondering where was this bird that was called the yellow-headed caracara. But that used to be rare. I mean, I have now, one morning I counted 50 caracaras pass over my house, and all going in the same direction. So it wasn't the same one coming back and forth. And I've seen groups of 14 near the airport. But that used to be in early 1980s, that was a rare bird, and crested caracara was very rare. We now have them both nesting in Trinidad. And it seems to be associated possibly with the spread of cattle ranching or deforestation generally. Because these are all birds that like open ranch land. The other one that we're seeing more frequently is double-striped thickney. Again, David Brooks, club member, had the first one in Queen's Park Savannah. But now and that was a very rare event. Now we're getting them, I don't think every year, but quite frequently. During this time too, unfortunately, we've lost a lot of our seed eaters. In Richard's time, the grey seed eater, yellow-bellied seed eater was quite common. Now we think we've lost certainly the grey seed eater. We don't think we have a viable natural population, but we do get yellow-bellied seed eaters coming in every year, probably from Venezuela, and nesting and probably going back, or maybe going somewhere else in Trinidad. But we have a much better idea now because of the records in the Bird Status and Distribution Committee. We also have some birds we didn't have before. So, for example, I said earlier that we had 53 species that have been added to the checklist. One of them is lion seed eater, which hadn't been recorded previously, and grassland yellowfinch, where there's a small population in a repo. Again, some of these things are coming in. We also have some exotic species, common waxbill, which has become naturalized and very abundant. Also tricolor nunia. So they're kind of taking over possibly some of the spaces that were left when the seed eaters were lost. So there are lots of people who are very, very concerned about the seed eaters, but that's one of the changes that has happened. Elizabeth mentioned the flamingos. The first record of flamingo, I think, was 1980. And then we've sort of, over the years, we've had 2s and 3s. And then we had a big group in Caribe. And for the last probably 5 years or so, there's been a big group in Caroni Swamp. And there is some evidence, I'm yet to be convinced, but there is some evidence of the nesting. For anybody who hasn't been to the Caroni Swamp recently, you should go because they're great to see. Again, this is a change in the avifauna. Can't blame this on cattle ranching, I don't think. When it first happened, I was worried that it might be that the birds were being threatened in Venezuela as conditions were bad and they were coming here. But I don't know what the situation is. But we enjoy seeing them and we're happy to have them. Of course, most of the changes now are going to be blamed on climate change, which is probably going to be the best explanation. Some other things we've had, we have anhingas nesting in Trinidad and Tobago. Again, when Richard was here, there were no records of nests. Now they regularly nest in Magdalena and down Point de Bear. And then we've had a new hummingbird, Amethyst Woodstar, which was nice because, well, I just happen to like hummingbirds. And I particularly like this one because it was in my garden. But now we're seeing them. The first record was not very long. I can't remember the day, but the year it was only a few years ago. And we tend to get them every year now, and they seem pretty reliable. I know this one looks a little manky. If it was a nice adult male, it would look like that. But the one I had didn't look like that. And a bird many of you will be familiar with from the bird count, the polytroper. Even this is a bird that in the 80s you had to go to the top of the top of River Valley or quite high altitude in order to see it. So we go up to that Lalaha and see it. We get it on the bird count. Now it's extending a lot further down. There's obviously been a range expansion of these. The one place you can get it at low altitude is the Tobago, but that's because they don't really have any high mountains. But the same way that Elizabeth was saying that they want to go up to Aripo because they want to get orange-billed nightingale thrush. We used to go up there to see polytroper, and now you get it below ways quite low down. I've seen it quite low down in Ariva Valley.
I've seen it on the beach.
On the beach?
Literally 50 meters from the water and actually the Tobago channel.
Ah, right. No, at Tobago it does go down to it does go down. Yeah. And of course, we have a couple sort of, when I started watching birds too, we also thought that blue-back manakins were extirpated from Tobago. And then somebody had a record in 1984, and they realized they had survived. And they have made a spectacular recovery since the hurricane. So that anywhere you stop in the forest now in Tobago, you could hear blue-back manakins. But I really thought that I would have never seen one in Tobago. And similarly, white-tailed saberwing has the same issue. In the populations were decimated by Hurricane Flora in 1963. Thank you. And it was before I was born. So that and for years and years, again, I remember going to Tobago in 1982 and being told that somebody had seen one allegedly, and walking up and down this Bainbridge Road, not seeing anything. Now there is a lady who has some feeders just behind Bloody Bay, and you can see 50 of them in one field of view. And in Coffee River, you can see another set. I mean, they've become quite abundant. Okay, so those were just sort of a snapshot of what has been changed. There are lots of other birds that have changed distribution. Some of them, we've got a better idea of what the distribution is. So it may be that the distribution didn't change, we just have a better understanding. But I've picked out somewhere, well, some for which I had photographs, a little bit of a biased sample, but also ones that people may have recognized over the years. So the third theme I want to look at is really what is special about the birds of Trinidad and Tobago. Because we all have our hobbies, and Raina will talk about what is special about the snakes and a little bit of fauna. Yasmin will talk about what's important about the plants, because we do feel it is important. And I'm looking at it from two perspectives. One is from a conservation perspective, and one is from a birdwatching perspective. Now, the importance of the birds from a conservation perspective, sorry that you can't read this text, but never mind. A lot of that was captured in an effort by BirdLife International to identify the worldwide program where they're trying to identify important bird areas. It was done some time ago. I can't remember when it started, but this was like 2000, so 20 years ago now. If from a conservation perspective and a habitat conservation perspective, what is the least habitat you could protect and have the biggest number of birds protected? So that now in Trinidad we have two endemic species, the Trinidad piping guan and the Trinidad marmot. And because those are restricted to Trinidad, those are automatically really, really important from a conservation perspective in Trinidad. And in fact, BirdLife International in establishing what they call these important bird areas, had a number of criteria by which they will decide this place is important. So if it houses a critically endangered species, it is important. If it houses a species which has got a very restricted range, it is important. If it houses 5% of the regional population of a species, it is important. And they also had one that if it houses more than 20,000 water birds, it's important. So based on that, we were able to determine what are the important areas within Trinidad. And what was important was the Northern Range because of piping guan, Victoria Mayara Reserve because of largely piping guan, the Kennedy Swamp and the West Coast mudflats because of the large numbers of congregatory water birds. Because we had, at the time, about 50,000 scarlet ibis. We had probably 6,000 to 10,000 of small sandpipers like semi-palmated and western sandpipers. We had 6,000 to 8,000 laughing gulls. So those were important. And then in Tobago, we had the main ridge because the white-tailed saber-wing is a very restricted range species. The coquelicot is a very restricted range species. And then there are a few restricted range subspecies that we tend not to think about too much, but we've got quite a lot of them in Trinidad. So that copper-rump hummingbird, there's a subspecies that lives in Trinidad alone, and there's another subspecies that lives in Tobago alone. And there's at the time there were 17 species that had probably what you might get away with calling an endemic subspecies. So those are important. So anyway, this is available online. It's by BirdLife International. It's a bit dated now in terms of the numbers. Oh, I forgot the main ones. So Giles Island and Little Tobago Island are really critically important for as seabird breeding colonies because they have estimated more than 5% of the regional population of Audubon shearwaters, and I think red-billed trumpet gets pretty good in there too, and also cricket birds. When this was done, the numbers that we had to work with were hopelessly out of date, so we're a little bit conservative. But I know that Darshan has been doing a lot of work with various people on some of those counts and getting some better counts. I don't know if anything will be published out of it. But certainly I think the counts that we used for this are greatly underestimated. And it's really an important thing to get sorted out. What was interesting from this is that when I look at the work that Floyd Hayes was doing in Trinidad, he was well ahead of us on all of this because his studies were on Trinidad piping guan, white-tailed saber-wing, and the offshore islands. So he obviously had decided up front these were the important things, and he did work on there. So let me show you a few pictures of some of them. Well, Trinidad piping guan. Mark is working on them now. Trinidad piping guan is something now when you see it, you no longer wet yourself. But it used to be like that. They've recovered really, really, really well. It doesn't mean we can let our guard down because they're probably still quite tasty. But they're now something that you can expect to see, and you can go and you're not really surprised when you see it once you're in the right habitat. Trinidad mock-mott. Well, anybody from Tobago is probably really, really annoyed that they call it Trinidad mock-mott. I really think that this is a case of lack of sensitivity on part of the people doing the names, but that's the name, and it is restricted to Trinidad and Tobago, so it's important from a conservation perspective. Scarlet ibis, that's important to us anyway, but because of the numbers in Carney Swamp is a really important area, especially because of the adjacent to the mudflats. And then on the mudflats, you get all sorts of western sandpipers, semi-palmated sandpipers, skimmers, gulls. There are a whole lot of birds down there. It's really important area. I think we estimated at one point that it's probably one of the most significant overwintering spots for laughing gulls because of the numbers we were seeing there. Although we do have to recognize that a lot of the adjacent coast in Venezuela and Guyana and Suriname, nobody goes and looks at it. so that there could be stuff there that we don't know about. And then, of course, on Trinidad and Tobago, we have the red-billed tropic bird, or the one shearwater, which is really kind of more important from the conservation perspective, lives in burrows, and kind of it's hard to photograph. Oops. Well, you saw the white-tailed saboing already. Again, this hummingbird is restricted to northern Venezuela and Tobago, so it's a restricted range species, which is important. And of course, the coquelicot, right? So now, again, you look in Tobago, and those of you who are young will see coquelicots all over the place. Before Mrs. Ale found the Grafton Estate started protecting them and feeding them, coquelicots were quite rare. When I was first started to watch birds, you didn't see them around much around Tobago. Now they've grown to a sort of legendary pet status. You know, it was brought home to me when a farmer in Tobago was explaining that as you go down in your farm and you're planting your corn piece by piece, you turn around and look, see a coquelicot following you and eating them. So I mean, they are a pest, and it is going to be something that bird watchers and farmers are going to have to come to some kind of agreement and deal with it. It's a real problem. But again, that wasn't always the case. It's because of the efforts of people to look after them. Which is why I wanted to, in the beginning, talk about Carol James and Howard Nelson with the typing one. Right, don't worry, coming to a close now. So that was what was important from a conservation point of view. Now I want to look at what's important what's exciting from a bird watching point of view. We used to talk a lot about how Trinidad had a very, very high diversity of birds per unit area. Because we had at the time something around 420 species, and we had kind of a small area. We also are a continental island, so we're close to the continental landmass, and continental landmasses tend to have a much higher diversity than islands that are stuck out by themselves. We also have a varied topography. So you have different birds at the top of a repo, then in Caribbean swamp. If you go to Barbados and stuff, everything is flat. The same birds everywhere. And also, because we're small, we can actually drive from the top of a repo to Caribbean swamp in a day. So when we have the bird count, that's what we do. We do Las Lapas in the morning, and we do Caribbean swamp in the afternoon. And so that if you actually work out the diversity per unit area, it looks really, really good. And that is what we would market. Certainly it is, right? That's what used to be marketed. Now, of course, when you go to a country like Colombia or Peru or Venezuela, you're not going to the whole country anyway, you're going to one spot. And the fact is that there's a lot of diversity of birds. I went online to just double check. Guyana has 812 species. I'm sure it's a lot more than that. But there are not a lot of bird watchers in Guyana. Panama 874, Peru 1906, and Colombia 1998. And then new numbers adding all the time, because they're taking some birds and advancing some subspecies into species, and then of course you have vagrants coming from other countries and so on. So the reason I highlight that is because we get so much enjoyment out of bird watchers. But I do, and many members of the club do. It would be people will get a lot more enjoyment if they go a little further afield than Trinidad and visit some of these neighboring countries. Because what is really special about Trinidad, or what is really useful from a bird watching perspective, is that Trinidad gives a nice cross-section of South American birds. Because there are lots of families of birds that are restricted to the New World and are mainly found in Central and South America. So you have the cotingas, which is like the bellbirds, and the cockle-rock, and well, there are lots of different cotingas, all different colors. The antbirds, little browns and grays with little spots that the non-bird watcher will have difficulty with. Hummingbirds, trogons, all limited to the Americas. And many of them are really tropical America. Because you have Texas coming down the side of Mexico, you get quite a lot of things, like you get trogons in Arizona and Texas and things like that. But really it's South America. you have a bewildering variety of tag and fly captions. You could be looking at two birds, and people who know what they're saying, that's three different species. You can't tell them apart. They look exactly the same, and they look like a Trinidad bird. But Trinidad gives you a very good introduction to these. And if you're a birdwatcher in Trinidad, you feel very comfortable throughout lowland South America because the birds are kind of familiar to you. If you're in Panama, you see things that you think of as Tobago birds, like red-crowned woodpecker, which we don't have here for some reason, but because they're coastal. And so that going further afield really helps you with your hobby, and other people will enjoy it as well. One of the things too we notice when you go further afield is it teaches us how to watch birds properly in Trinidad. Because I remember going to Venezuela with the club and seeing a kiskadee and getting confused as to whether it was a kiskadee. A kiskadee is so common in Trinidad, we don't really pay attention to it. And when you travel, you begin to think, ooh, is this the same kiskadee? And you don't want to ask anybody because you're supposed to know a kiskadee if you live in Trinidad. So you sit down there and you take a description. Whereas taking descriptions is a good thing for people to do when they're watching birds. So the TTFNC has been to Venezuela, I think 4 times. We've been twice to Guyana, Suriname, St. Vincent, Dominica. And I just want to, these are the ones I can remember. And it was thanks mainly to Selwyn, Deo, Richard, and recently to Elizabeth. And it's really, I was fortunate last year to be able to go on the first bird watching trip that wasn't a field naturalist trip. But it's because of what the field naturalists have done that I have been able to see some of the birds in those countries. And I want to encourage you club to continue doing that. And I will end on that side. There is, of course, a big problem with the cost because these things are not cheap. It's very expensive to go as an individual to some of these countries and do a bird watching trip or to join a trip because these are people from Europe and from North America who have a lot higher salaries than we have. But when you go with a group, you're able to get some economies of scale because the trips the field naturalists have done have been really, really cost effective, and we get some really good guides. So when you travel, you realize some interesting things. Some of the birds, as I say, throughout you travel all the way to Peru or Colombia, and you're seeing the same species. Now, blue-tailed emerald is kind of, we think of it as quite rare in Trinidad. We feel we have some chagramas to see it. So this photograph was in Lupino. That photograph was in Peru. And it's exactly the same bird across this wide range. And you're looking at all these hummingbirds, and they're all different, and you're getting confused. But that one looks familiar. You realize some. But yet there's some, and I put this in because I couldn't resist the photograph. Well, we have tufted coquette in Trinidad, and we're all familiar with. Everybody who takes photographs when they first get their camera, one bird they want to take a photograph is a tufted coquette. In Peru, they have a crested coquette, which is the same, basically variation on a theme. I actually think our tufted coquette is nicer because we have the sort of little operculum coming off the cheeks there. I will remind you because I think it's true. But so that you're seeing variations on a theme. When you travel too, you sometimes see birds that are really rare in Trinidad, but they're kind of common where you're going to. So we get to see things like king vulture. And those of you, everybody who was in the club when we went to Venezuela last time, we were able to be under the tree with a nice king vulture. And then many, many more examples of that. I know that Elizabeth gave a nice slideshow of the birds we saw in Guyana last time. So I don't want to give you any of those, except I couldn't resist the cocktail dogs. And then finally, our last slide. I have been advocating for Selwyn and Elizabeth that the club do a trip to Panama. Good, perfect. Because Panama is a place where you could get a lot of advanced framework in terms of bird watching. It's a lovely country, lovely habitat. and really, really good accommodation prices. And with a nice big group that could fill a bus and get a guide and a driver, we could do very, very well. And of course, because the philatelists are not only interested in birds, it's good if nice thing about Panama is got other wildlife as well. Wonderful mammals, which we don't see in Trinidad and Tobago hardly. I'm sure there's some herbs that will interest Rainer and others. And it could be really a cost-effective way of seeing some of these places. So with that call to Elizabeth, which she seems to have already answered, thank you for listening. I will take any questions if anybody has.